Continuamos con este ciclo de conferencias con el profesor Jesse Prinz. El tema de hoy es el origen de la moralidad. Quisiera muy brevemente contextualizar un poco el tema de la discusión de hoy, la ponencia de hoy. Como ustedes recordarán, fue Thomas Hobbes quizá el primer filósofo que planteó que la moral no es una ley natural, sino es el producto de una suerte de pacto social, o sea, es un producto cultural. Y esta idea la mantuvo Hobbes y Locke y Rousseau hasta relativamente hace muy poco tiempo. Quizá fue Darwin el primero en cuestionarla hace 150 años. Pero hace menos tiempo aún, no más de 10 o 15 años, se han planteado tesis que sostienen que hay un tipo de moral innata, una moral que es producto de la evolución de la especie y que está configurada en el cerebro. Algunos autores incluso han hablado de un módulo moral, o sea, una moral universal, innata, que tendría las mismas características que el lenguaje. De hecho, el primero en hacer una analogía de este tipo fue el filósofo norteamericano John Rawls, quien dijo que así como probablemente hay un módulo lingüístico que es innato y que se activa con el medio, podría haber un módulo moral que se activa también con el medio, ¿no? Esto lo dice John Rawls casi de pasada. El filósofo Mijail, how do you pronounce it in Michael, lo desarrolla una tesis doctoral. Luego Mark Hauser lo desarrolla más abundantemente en un famoso libro que se llama Moral Minds, las mentes morales. Entonces hay todo un movimiento en la línea de intentar probar que hay una moral innata, que es universal y que tiene características que se pueden reconocer, así como si hubiera una gramática profunda. Bueno, Jesse Prinz objeta todo eso. Jesse Prinz va a sostener todo lo contrario. Él considera que todos esos movimientos innatistas están equivocados y hoy día nos va a dar las razones por las cuales considera eso. Entonces tenemos la suerte de tener a Jesse Prinz porque es parte de un debate muy importante, muy actual además, que está en la frontera de la disciplina sobre el origen de la moral.
I mostly want to talk about the question of origin, so where morality comes from, but I want to say just as a reminder for everyone a little bit about what morality is. That was the theme yesterday. Then we'll focus on this question, so the question of where our moral values come from. And if we have time, I want to say a little bit about whether the investigation of the origins So I'll talk about what morality is. That's just a brief summary from yesterday. Where morality comes from, that will be the main focus. And then I want to talk a little bit about whether the investigation of the origin of morality can be used as a form of moral critique. The word that's usually used in English is debunking, I guess, desbaratar, que es desbaratar, whether you can use the investigation of morality as a way to debunk moral claims. And that we'll discuss briefly as well if there's time. So just as a reminder from yesterday, the framework that I'm working within is related to the views of David Hume and other figures in the history of philosophy, according to which morality is fundamentally about the emotions. The story that I tried to tell yesterday can be summarized in the following way. When you witness an event, a morally questionable event, like someone stealing a wallet, you categorize that event. So this is a case of pickpocketing or taking something from someone's pocket. That's a case of taking property. And then stored in your mind, in your long-term memory, you have a negative sentiment towards taking property. And that negative sentiment causes you to have an emotion. And if you remember from yesterday, a sentiment is a disposition to have an emotion. It's not itself an emotion. So which emotion you have is going to depend on what kind of events you're witnessing and who it is performing the event. So if you see somebody being robbed, then that is a crime against a person. And if it's the robber is someone other than the self, then the emotion you'll experience is going to be anger, and that anger will then be directed at the perceived event. So this is the basic sequence that would occur if you were to witness an act that you consider to be immoral. And to draw a further distinction, we can think about the long-term memory structure, the thing you have in your mind, stored in your mind, that involves a sentiment towards taking property, a negative sentiment towards taking property as a moral value. This is your moral value or your moral norm. So your moral values are with you at all times, even if you're not thinking about them. They're stored in long-term memory. And when you actually see an instance of stealing, of robbing, then you have an actual emotional state, and that's a moral judgment. So a moral value is a disposition to have the emotion. A moral judgment is the emotion itself. And you might express this by saying, that's bad, that's wrong, that's immoral, that's evil, and so on. We also have words like stealing. So it's an old philosophical observation made by a philosopher named Bernard Williams that some words used in the moral domain are simultaneously descriptive and also evaluative. So when you say that something is a case of killing, that's a neutral expression. To kill is just to take a life. But if you call something murder, you've said, in effect, that it's not only a case of killing, but it's a bad case of killing. If you say that something is taking property, that's a neutral expression. But if you call it stealing or robbing, that's an evaluative expression. And you can think about these evaluative expressions, which Bernard Williams calls thick concepts, as having an emotional component and a descriptive component. So it's anger as applied to the taking of property. So that's the basic framework. Moral judgments are emotional states, and expressions like stealing or murder are also emotionally charged descriptions. Okay, that's the basic theory, which I won't defend here. I tried to provide evidence yesterday. What I really want to talk about is where values come from, and there are various different answers to this question. So one answer coming from various religious traditions is that values are given to us by some divine authority. So values are handed down from God. So we have in the Judeo-Christian tradition this story about Moses receiving the Ten Commandments from God and then delivering them to the people. So one possible origin story about morality is that morality is dictated from a divine source. And I have very little to say about this kind of origin story. Some people think it faces an objection called the non-existence problem. That is to say, they don't believe in the divine source. But I don't even think one needs to get too deeply involved in questions about the existence of God, because the deeper problem with this kind of origin story is it's an epistemological problem. And the question is, whose God is the one that's authoritative? So each religious tradition that has a moralizing religion, each religion that comes with a moral code, claims that their moral code has been handed down from a divine source. And it's very difficult to decide between which of these possible divine sources is the correct one. In each case, the nature of knowledge is testimony from revelation. So we've received testimony, we've received people reporting that they have gotten this information through revelation, but who should we listen to? And which interpretation is right? So it will not have gone unnoticed, for example, that even in the Judeo-Christian tradition, interpretations of the Christian Bible are extremely diverse and extremely selective. So, for instance,
There's much in the Bible about polygamy. There's much in the Bible about slavery. There's much in the Bible about the right to kill your spouse if she is unfaithful. And notice the she there. So there are asymmetries, gender asymmetries in the Bible that are not considered authoritative anymore by contemporary biblical moralizers. The questions about how to interpret these divinely revealed values become very, very difficult to resolve. But more importantly, I think once we start to see this, we can realize that the interpretations that people actually have, forgetting about whether there could be a divine source for morality, those interpretations are products of culture. So the fact that we now remove these references to slavery in our interpretation of the Bible is a product of our current values and that's a result of our particular history. So even if there were a divine source, it's not the actual origin of the values we possess. A more promising source, you might think, comes from this guy, Charles Darwin. A Darwinian approach to morality would say that morality is really an evolved trait. It's like our ability to see. It's like our ability to solve very specific adaptive problems, like choosing a mate. On this view, morality is given to us as part of our biology. And there are various ways one might try to establish a Darwinian approach. One is to look for animal precursors. So if morality is a product of evolution, there should be non-human animals that have norms that are similar in some respect to human animals. So we should be able to find, if not exactly morality in non-human animals, something in non-human animals that looks like it might be related to what we find in human beings, especially in apes, our closest relatives. We might also try and look for universals. So if morality is part of our biology, we might expect the same moral values to be shared cross-culturally, at least some of them. And there might also be direct evidence that morality is innate, that it's not learned. So if we could find evidence of these kinds, we would find some support for the view that morality has its basis in biology. I want to briefly talk about all of these different sources of evidence. I don't think morality has evolved, so just to avoid suspense, I don't think the Darwinian approach turns out to be correct, or at least it's very incomplete. But I will pass over some of these issues more quickly than they deserve. On the question of animal precursors, most of the research has gone into studying the social behavior of apes. Mostly chimpanzees are our closest relatives. And the claim is that chimpanzees engage in a lot of behaviors that look closely related to morality in human beings. For example, chimpanzees have principles of reciprocity. So if one chimp receives a favor from another, that chimp will reciprocate. Chimps keep track of how many of these reciprocal behaviors have taken place, so they can punish somebody who hasn't reciprocated. They also engage in peacekeeping behavior, so if chimps are fighting, there might be interventions, or after a fight, one chimp might try and comfort another chimp who's been a victim of a violent interaction. And these kinds of behaviors look like things that we care about when we think about morality. Now, one initial worry about this strategy of inferring from this behavior that there is a moral capacity or even a pre-moral capacity in chimps is that when you see an animal doing something nice, something that we would consider morally praiseworthy in a human being, it doesn't mean that they're doing it because they have a moral rule. So to see this, consider insect behavior. So insects engage in extreme forms of altruism. One insect will sacrifice its life to save others. So for example, many forms of bees will try and sting you if you approach the nest of the bees. And when they do that, they'll die. And they do that to protect the nest. So this is incredible altruism, right? They're giving over their life to save all these other bees. But should we conclude that bees have a moral sense, that they're doing this because this is what morality demands of them? It seems more plausible to assume that they just have a kind of instinct to engage in this kind of behavior, and they don't need to think about this as a moral requirement. It's no more a moral requirement for them than eating or seeking food. They're not doing it because they've thought of these things in a moral way. What is it to think of something in a moral way? Well, if the theory of morality that I presented yesterday is correct, basically David Hume's theory of morality, then to have a moral judgment requires certain kinds of emotions. And there's a question, does a bee or an insect experience guilt? Does a bee or an insect experience moral disgust? And the answer is probably no. The answer may be no in apes as well. It's also worth noting in this context that psychopaths, people who have been diagnosed as psychopaths, do show reciprocal forms of altruism. So reciprocal altruism means that if you do something nice for me, I'll do something nice for you. If you scratch my back, I'll scratch your back. Now, chimps do this, but so do psychopaths. And as I mentioned yesterday, psychopaths have been shown to have a very disturbed comprehension of morality. Arguably, they have no understanding of morality whatsoever. But they can reason, and they recognize that if they do something nice for you, that you'll do something nice for them. So just by reason alone, without using any kind of emotion or moral appreciation, they can recognize the instrumental value of reciprocation. And it may be that chimps are doing the same. There are some differences between chimp psychology and human psychology that raise doubts about whether chimps have anything like a moral sense. One of the very characteristic aspects of human morality is called ultrasociality. And ultrasociality just means that we have moral concern not just for ourselves or our family members, but for people completely unrelated. So I have no relatives in Afghanistan, but when I hear about a massacre that's taken place there, I feel that this is morally wrong. I want to intervene. I think this should be stopped. I'm not directly affected by it, but I think it should be stopped. So when you have this kind of situation where you're extending your values to people who are not related to you, you're engaged in a kind of abstraction that goes from your personal life to a more general form of rule. So the rule is that killing an innocent person is wrong no matter who does it. But with apes, you don't see this kind of concern. They're concerned for their selves, their families, maybe their group, but they don't show this concern for unrelated others. There's also no evidence for guilt and shame in chimps. There's been no successful effort to identify signs of these emotions in other species. It's a somewhat complex issue because researchers haven't figured out a perfect methodology for identifying guilt and shame, but we don't see any direct evidence for this so far. So at least at the moment, as far as we know, chimps may be missing these emotions. Think about a very young child. So a very young child may commit a bad act. Maybe they destroy something in the house, and you'll get angry at the child, and the child will be afraid, but the child won't necessarily feel guilty. And chimps may show fear of punishment, but they don't necessarily show guilt. For instance, they don't try to compensate for the wrongs that they've done, or conceal themselves in the way we might hide our face when we're ashamed. In fact, the best evidence for guilt and shame in non-human species comes from a very different animal, comes from an animal known in these parts very well, the dog, perros, because dogs are animals that human beings have bred, and over the centuries, they've taken on a lot of traits that are very important to human life, including a tendency to show some sign of regret when they misbehave. But you don't see that with chimps. Also, chimps can be extremely selfish, so we get a lot of research showing that chimps reciprocate behavior, but chimps also do things that are quite striking. So, for instance, if a chimp has an opportunity to give food to a member of its group at no cost to itself, it's unlikely to do so, or it's the likelihood it will do so is basically random, it's chance. They show no special interest in being nice to each other, even when there's no cost, even when it's free. So if you could give your friend a meal and it wouldn't cost you anything, so suppose I came up to you and I said, here's a little a coupon. I know you've eaten already, but if you give this to your friend, they can come eat in this restaurant for free. And if you said, okay, and then you just sort of threw it in the air, thinking maybe your friend will catch it, maybe not, that would be a very strange behavior, but that's exactly the way chimps behave. Now, that said, I don't think the evidence about chimp morality can be completely dismissed. The behavior is real. Chimps do tend to engage in reciprocal altruism, for instance, but there are explanations of this that don't involve positing a moral capacity in chimps. One explanation has to do with what's called inclusive fitness. So in evolutionary theory, inclusive fitness refers to the tendency to engage in behavior that will promote the likelihood that your relatives will survive. So animals that are behaving in accordance with natural selection will first and foremost try to protect themselves. They'll fight for their own survival, but they'll also they'll fight for the survival of their relatives. And we do see some evidence for this in chimpanzees, but it's not clear whether they'll, again, fight for the survival of unrelated others. There are models of chimp sharing that posit what's called tolerated theft. So suppose I come over here and I take Pablo's watch and I walk away, and and we're both chimps. Chimps don't wear watches, but maybe it's a banana. And I take his watch, and you observe this. You're a scientist, you're an ethologist studying chimpanzee behavior. You might say, oh, Pablo is such a nice guy. This was a case of altruism. He's been really kind to me by letting me take his watch. But maybe I'm a bigger chimp, and maybe the only reason he's let me take the watch is if he didn't, I would fight him for it. So some cases of behavior that look like they involve sharing out of kindness really involve a kind of stealing, where one ape will allow the other ape to steal in order to avoid conflict. I think that the reciprocal behavior we see in chimps is probably present in human beings as well, and it may exert a kind of constraint on human morality, which is to say our tendency to want to reciprocate may be one of the things that contributes to how we construct moral rules. But it's only a very weak constraint. As we'll see, the human rules for sharing, the human rules for dividing resources are extremely variable. So the kind of contribution we get from our biology may be quite limited. So sorry that the slide is cut off here. This is a technical point, but there's some research that's been done by Boyd and Richardson, who are two anthropologists who do formal models of evolutionary behavior, suggesting that in fact human tendencies to have moral rules, human tendency to be kind to strangers, depend on what's called cultural group selection, which is a kind of it's a kind of selection that's not natural, that occurs outside of biology. It occurs in the course of history. And their argument can be briefly summarized as follows. So in order to get a moral norm off the ground, it's important to punish the behavior of an individual who violates that norm. You have to punish a person who violates the norm. If you yourself are the victim then you have a personal stake in reacting and punishing that, that animal, that individual that has aggressed against you. But why would another animal try to intervene? For the other animal, they're not threatened in any way, so they have no motivation to try and punish the animal that's aggressed against you. So this is a very tricky bit of behavior to get off the ground. And evolutionary models suggest that the only way to get it off the ground is if a failure to punish is itself a crime. So if Pablo attacks me, I'm of course going to attack him. But what motivation do you have to attack Pablo? You're not being affected by him. The answer is, suppose I punish you for not punishing him. Now you have a motivation to punish him. So we get what's called meta-punishment, which is punishment for not punishing. We have moral rules involving punishment itself. And this turns out, for technical reasons, to be very, very difficult to achieve through natural selection. The basic reason is that punishment is costly, it's difficult. If you try to punish Pablo, even though you haven't been affected, he might now attack you. So it's a big risk with very little direct benefit. And it's very easy to try to avoid that responsibility. So what's called the free rider problem is especially strong in this case, because you can always sort of walk away from the scene and hope that some other individual comes in and punishes Pablo. It's very easy to get away with not contributing to meta-punishment. And Boyd and Richardson have argued that if you actually construct a computer model of an animal species and you actually put meta-punishment in, you actually program the model so that the animals engage in meta-punishment, it disappears very quickly because people try to get it, the computer simulation tries to, just by random mutation, generate a few individuals who stop engaging in this behavior. That turns out to be advantageous, so meta-punishment disappears in a few generations. But there is a way to get meta-punishment off the ground, and that's through cultural group selection. So group selection is a form of selection that's not biological in nature, and it does not involve the survival chances of an individual organism, an individual animal. Instead, it involves the success of a complete group of individuals. And it turns out that if you have one group of individuals that engage in meta-punishment, and they're competing for resources with another group of individuals that don't have meta-punishment, the group with meta-punishment does better. Individuals in the group with meta-punishment have greater risks, so they do worse individually, but the whole group will do better as a complete unit. And as a result, they will defeat competitors that are trying to gain access to the same resources. For example, if two groups are trying to forage or find food in the same area, and one of them has these meta-punishment norms, they're going to be able to create so much more cooperation within the group that they'll end up defeating the other group. So meta-punishment can get off the ground with cultural group selection. The problem is that models of cultural group selection suggest that because this trait can't get fixed biologically, it has to spread culturally. And to spread culturally requires social learning, and social learning requires cognitive abilities that have not been demonstrated in apes. So if you look at ape behavior, we sometimes see headlines about ape culture, but the truth is apes are very, very limited with respect to social transmission of information. So one ape group might devise a way to crack nuts that gets spread throughout the group, but really when that happens, it's a kind of accident. It's not very robust, and it's not even clear how it takes place. Human beings are very, very good at social learning. We can use language, but we also have what might be called an instinct to imitate. So apes can engage in some limited forms of imitation, but human beings imitate almost obsessively. So if an ape sees a way to achieve a goal without imitation, it won't imitate. But human beings imitate like a compulsion. They do it automatically. They can't stop doing it. And they can imitate in a way that involves incremental learning because they have a capacity to store information. So if I learn a small skill by imitating your expert skill, I can then extend my small skill bit by bit, incrementally, and get a more and more complex skill. And we see no evidence for this kind of complex social learning in apes. So once we get into a behavior that requires this kind of social transmission, the likelihood that it can be found in other species diminishes greatly. So for these kinds of reasons, I suspect that even if there is a biological precursor to morality, it never gets to the level of abstraction of generalized moral rules. Those require meta-punishment, and meta-punishment requires social learning, and the kind of social learning required is not present in apes. Another kind of evidence for morality being biologically based would be the discovery of moral universals. And this is a very controversial topic. My own view is that there are no moral universals. So that's a very strong view. I think if you come up with any moral rule, you will find exceptions to it. You will find cultures that don't abide by this rule. Now, you could describe a rule so vaguely, so incompletely, that you could get something that looks like a universal. Like, so consider the following rule. In all cultures, it's wrong to do something. So every culture has something it's wrong to do. That is a universal rule, but it has no content. As soon as we specify a content, it's hard to find a universal. Maybe every culture has a rule against killing certain people, but which people vary from culture to culture. And norms against killing are quite different cross-culturally. So, for example, in contemporary culture, our rate of homicide is very, very low, lower than any other time in human history. In a recent book, Steven Pinker has argued that over the last 2 centuries, there's been a really dramatic drop in homicide and killing. And if you look, for example, at people who are members of small-scale societies, this is a picture of a group called the Foray in Papua New Guinea. Their homicide rates are often extremely high. So to give you some examples, among men, just looking at the men, men die in these cultures by homicide at rates between 25 and 35%. So prior to colonialization in Papua New Guinea, the homicide rate for men was between 25 and 35%. And about 50% actually commit homicides. So all the men in the room, todos los hombres, raise your hand. Okay, now imagine that half of those people had committed a murder, right? So this is very alien. Maybe some of you, maybe there's someone in this room who's committed a murder, but that itself would be surprising. It's possible. But if we were in Papua New Guinea, it would be likely. So that's quite a difference. And if you study the attitudes of people in these groups, they look very different from ours. Taking another life often involves some kind of justification, but not always, and not always of the kind we give. It may be perfectly permissible to kill a member of the outgroup. There's some anthropological work that was done on a group of headhunters in the Philippines. And this is a group called the Ilonggot, who still exists, but at the turn of the early part of the 20th century, they had not yet come into much contact with people from other cultures. And into the middle of the 20th century, these headhunters could still be interviewed and describe their cultural traditions. And they regularly killed people. They cut off their heads. And they would do this for various reasons that look very strange to us. So, for instance, they would do it as a way to relax. They would do it as a rite of passage. They would do it if somebody died of natural causes as part of a way of mourning. If you were feeling very sad, one way to cope with your sadness is to go and cut off somebody's head. So next time you're depressed, think about that. Maybe you should cut off somebody's head. It will make you feel better. So this looks very unusual to us. A more familiar case in ancient Rome, blood sports were very, very popular. Gladiatorial tournaments were very popular. So if you look at the Colosseum, the Coliseo in Rome, in Roma, it seats 40,000 people, and another 10,000 people could stand there. So 50,000 people would gather into this stadium frequently to watch human beings kill each other brutally with blunt instruments. Now we have boxing, we have wrestling, we have some violent sports. But if suppose that the mayor or governor of Rome said, okay, we want to reopen the Colosseum and have people start to kill each other there again. We think it will be very good for tourism. There would be something strange about this. To the modern ear, this sounds really, really bizarre. But for 500 years, blood sports were the most popular form of entertainment in the Roman Empire. For 1,000 years in China, with a few brief periods of critique, this practice was widespread. So women of every social station would have their feet cracked when they were about 4 years old and tied together. And it would cause excruciating pain. These women would be permanently disabled. Walking for many of them would be difficult. Running would be impossible. The ideal size for a foot was 3 inches, about this big. So it's really almost like the foot of an animal, like a llama or something. It's just a hoof, not a foot. The practice was considered morally acceptable. It was also aesthetic. These feet would rot, they would decay, and it would cause gangrene, a strong kind of decay, which would produce a very strong odor. And the odor was eroticized, so you can see many Chinese poets writing love poems about the fragrance of a rotting foot. So it's also a case of aesthetic relativism. But if this were suggested that we should break the feet of all women and tie them up, that would be considered morally outrageous. But for 1,000 years in China, it was considered acceptable. I mentioned before that chimps engage in various kinds of reciprocal behavior. You can think about these as principles of distributive justice, principles of fairness, how to distribute a resource across individuals. And human beings care a lot about resource distribution, but our attitudes towards resource distribution vary from culture to culture. We can do a little test of Peruvian values in this room. So there are consider three choices. Imagine that you are the boss of a big company, and at the end of the year, you have a lot of money left over, and you can give away the money as a special bonus, as a special gift to your workers. And you have three choices. So choice one is to give the most money to the workers who worked hardest, the ones who produced most money for the company. So you give more money to those who worked harder and produced more. That's called the equity option. The second option is you can take all this money and distribute it equally. So all workers get the same amount of money. That's called the equality option. And a third choice is to distribute on the basis of need. So you take the workers who are most poor and have the most financial trouble, and you give them more money than the others. So now we can choose. So how many of you would give more money to the hardest workers? Few, okay. How many of you would give equal money to everyone? Comunista. How many of you would give to the needy? Okay, that's really fascinating. It's actually, I'm very fascinated, but we should do this study here in Peru. The study has been done in the United States. And in the United States, the vast majority prefer equity. They prefer giving the most to the hardest workers. And you can think about this as very connected to capitalism, especially capitalism in a fairly affluent society. Because here you don't, North Americans don't think very much about the needy, and they think that the something that's very morally important is the ability to achieve success by your own initiative. So North Americans like to reward hard work. They see that as central to the American ideal of capitalism. And they're a bit naive about the fact that different individuals' ability and motivation to work might be affected by a wide range of different variables. But as a result, they tend to think equity is the best solution. The study was done in China, and the Chinese, in mainland China, the Chinese preferred equality. And you can see a kind of socialist or communist worldview contributing to the idea that each should get the same. It's also very connected to a collectivist worldview. Each person should get the same. And in India, where there is extreme poverty and very limited social welfare, there is a cultural tradition of individuals giving to the needy. So if a poor person knocks on your door, especially if it's a lot of these poor people become kind of spiritual figures who live off the charity of others, and they ask for a meal, you might give that person a meal. In India, the favorite choice is to distribute money on the basis of need. So it'd be interesting to think about whether there's something about the Peruvian situation that combines a kind of sensitivity to poverty and need, while also connecting to these more capitalist principles of free enterprise. In fact, you might look at individual differences and see whether people who are socialist in orientation tend to pick the equality solution, people who are more conservative pick equity, and so on. There are huge cross-cultural differences in how helpful people are. I don't know if Lima was included in this study, but a few years ago, there was a massive study done in many, many cities around the world where the question is, are people helpful? And one way they tested it is you would walk down the street and drop something. So do I have anything I can drop? I can drop my wallet. You would drop a pen or something. So you're walking down the street, you drop that, and then you just see whether someone else picks it up and gives it to you. Yeah? So it turns out some places are extremely unhelpful. North American cities like New York are not very helpful. I think Kuala Lumpur is the least helpful in the world that was studied. And some places are very helpful. So for example, of the South American cities that I can recall, I think Rio de Janeiro in Brazil is the very top of the list. It's a very helpful city. We think about it as a city with a lot of social problems, but people are really very, very nice, which suggests differences in morality. Maybe I'll skip this on India. But we talked yesterday about incest. You might recall this couple who are brother and sister in Germany. And attitudes towards incest are varied cross-culturally. So most cultures have certain relationships, incestuous relationships, that won't arise. But what counts as incest varies quite a bit from culture to culture. For example, in Christianity, it's considered bad to marry your cousin, especially if it's a first cousin. But by medieval times in Christianity, even marrying the seventh generation, your cousin 7 times away, was considered illegal. And does anyone in this room know someone who's married to their cousin? Okay, so it may be more common here. It's less common in the US. In the US, it's quite rare. In other places, it's quite common. So you can see, for example, in the Islamic world, that it's actually the preferred form of marriage. Interestingly, Darwin was married to his first cousin, so it's not that it doesn't exist in the Christian European tradition, but variation on whether cousin marriage counts as incest varies from culture to culture. And we'll see further variation in this as we go along. What about innateness? So is it the case that morality is innate? In the introduction, you heard a little bit about this idea from John Rawls, that Rawls, the philosopher Rawls, argued that we have an innate capacity for morality that's very much like our capacity for language. So just as we may have an innate capacity to organize words into sentences, we have innate capacity to form moral judgments. And like language, these judgments are highly structured, they're highly complex, and they're unlearned. For the record, I don't think language is innate. So until recently, the majority of cognitive scientists, the majority of linguists, believe that the evidence for innateness of language was so strong that it couldn't even be seriously challenged. And now there's really been a strong turn. And it's still only a minority, but there are a growing number of linguists who think that language is not innate. I don't think language is innate, and I don't think morality is innate, but let me give you an example of the kind of evidence that's been used to argue for innateness. John Mikhail, Mark Hauser, and others have used these kinds of trolley or train dilemmas that we talked about yesterday to show that people's judgments are very systematic and very difficult to understand on the basis of explicit principles. So consider, it's a little hard to tell from this picture, but imagine that there's a train heading towards 5 people, and then you have an opportunity to turn that train onto a second track, and it will kill 1 person if it goes onto that second track. So how many of you think it's permissible to turn a train that's heading towards 5 people onto a different side where it will kill just 1? Is it permissible to do this? Yeah. So 90% say this is permissible. Consider a small variation. So in this case, and we saw this example yesterday, the train is heading towards 5 people, and this time you can stop the train by pushing a big person in front of the train. Is this permissible? Now only 11% say it's permissible. So very similar, you have 5 people who are about to die. You have an opportunity to save them by causing 1 person to die. Here, everyone says it's okay. Here, everyone says it's bad. And these cases can be even stranger. So consider this case. A trolley is heading towards 5 people. You can turn it onto a different track where it will kill 1 person, but then it will, if this person hadn't been there, the trolley would continue on and kill these 5 people. So the only difference between this case and this case is here, this guy is just going to be killed because he happens to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Here, this guy is going to stop the trolley with his weight. It's because he's a big guy that the trolley will stop, and the trolley would otherwise have gone on to kill these 5 people. Now the approval ratings drop to 55%. So, 2 cases very similar. The only difference is really whether the track merges back with the original track, but the different approval rating is dramatic. And one more case. Here, exactly the same as this case, except instead of a big guy, you have a little guy and a very large weight, a very large object. And now it's not the guy, but the large object that stops the train, but the guy gets killed. And suddenly you jump up to 72% approval. So these 2 cases are almost the same, but a very, very different approval rating. These are very big differences in psychology. So what's going on here? It's very difficult to articulate what's going on. If you try to express what the reasoning is, you'll do very badly. So participants in these experiments have been asked to justify their responses, and they can't. They do very badly. They don't come up with good justifications. But they seem to still respond systematically. So defenders of this moral grammar view have pointed out that this is very much like language. Because with language, people have a very clear and systematic opinion about which sentences are grammatically correct and which sentences are grammatically incorrect. But if they try to articulate those rules, if they try to state the rule, they'll do very badly. They can't express what those rules are. And this suggests that there is an innate and very complex way of representing these different cases that must be innate. If we can't articulate these rules, it doesn't look like a rule that we've simply learned. And it seems to be very sensitive to subtle differences in a way that suggests it's a complex rule, and that complexity is reminiscent of, it reminds us of the kind of complexity involved in language. Now, I think the basic problem with this argument for innateness is that there's a much simpler explanation of this pattern of results. And the explanation is just that we have a single rule, and we learn that rule. We learn it through instruction. We learn it through observation. We learn it culturally. And it's just that causing somebody to die intentionally, killing someone intentionally, is morally wrong. Suppose you've just learned that rule. I mean, this is the only, you've been explicitly taught it's wrong to intentionally kill someone, as all of us are explicitly taught. If that's the only thing in your head, that's enough to explain these results. That one simple rule, you don't need anything more complex. And the reason for that is that each of these cases is a different distance away from the simplest way of conceptualizing or imagining intentionally killing someone. So in this case, you have to intentionally push somebody to his death. You're directly, physically causing somebody to die. You're doing it intentionally with a physical act of aggression. So in psychological terminology, this is a prototypical case of killing. If you move down here, down here, in this case, you have to intend that this guy dies. If he doesn't die, the trolley would continue on. So you have to form the intention that this person die. You want this person to die. You form the desire that this person be killed. But you're not physically aggressing against him. So it is close to the prototype of killing, but because there's no act of physical assault, it's a little bit less like the prototype. And if you go through all of the cases, each one is a little less like that prototype of killing. So if we make judgments on the basis of similarity to a prototype, similarity to an ideal example, then we can explain why moral intuitions are subtly different as we change these cases. I think I may skip this. I'll say something quickly about this. Some people who believe in innate morality have argued that there is an innate capacity to distinguish between the moral domain and the domain of mere conventions. So, for example, rules of etiquette, how you dress, and so on. All of these are rules of etiquette. They're not moral rules. And the claim has been made that the moral rules and the conventional rules are very different. They differ in three different ways. First of all, moral rules are independent of authority. So suppose I say, okay, in this institution, you're allowed to speak without raising your hand. If you just want to, if I say now, everyone can just speak out without raising your hand. Can you do that? Is that permitted? So if I just announce now that everyone can speak without putting your hand up, that would be okay? It's okay, then that's fine. But suppose I say, okay, everyone's allowed to hit each other. So if you want to just punch the person next to you, is that okay? So do I have the authority to simply change these rules? Well, I can change one kind of rule, but not the other. Conventional rules can be changed by an authority, but moral rules can't be changed. Suppose somebody speaks without raising their hand. How serious is that? How serious a violation is that? It's somewhat obnoxious or selfish, but it's not a terrible thing to do. But if one of you hits another, that would be considered very serious. If somebody speaks out today without raising their hand, no one is going to go home to their friends and family and say, oh, this incredible thing happened at the university today. But if one of you just punched the other, this would be like on the nightly news. It would be a very strange event. And also with moral rules, so moral rules are more serious, And also with moral rules, when people give a justification, they tend to make an appeal to empathy. They think about the suffering of the victim. But with conventional rules, this happens less frequently. So a very robust pattern in moral rules. This was discovered by a psychologist named Turiel, Nucci, and Smetana. And they found this pattern even in early development. By the age of 2.5 or 3 years old, children are distinguishing moral and conventional rules. And this, they think, is evidence for innateness. But there are some problems with this argument for innateness. First of all, the distinction between moral and conventional rules turns out to be much harder to draw, much messier, much vaguer than the original research suggested. There are a lot of rules that are borderline cases. And you can even imagine a case where people consider something that we find morally wrong to be morally permissible in another time period. Research by Dan Kelly and Steve Stitch have tried to replicate the original studies that showed a moral conventional distinction using somewhat different examples, and they find that depending on which examples you choose, the distinction can go away. Let me just say something about learnability. So one of the crucial findings in the research in developmental psychology is that young children draw a distinction between moral and conventional rules. I mentioned that already. But another crucial finding is that these rules are socialized in a very different way. They're taught or learned in a very different way. Moral rules are taught with a strong emotional response. And the emotions involved include things like anger, disgust. Children are encouraged to feel guilt and shame. You should feel ashamed of yourself if you do something immoral. But conventional rules are taught in a very different way. Emotions are involved, but very different emotions. For instance, if you violate conventions, you might be ridiculed. So if you say maybe there's a rule against wearing a hat when you're eating food, and your parents might laugh at you for wearing your hat. These differences in patterns of training might account for the difference in moral and conventional rules. Yesterday, I mentioned that children are exposed to a very extensive emotional conditioning during child development. During the first 9 years of life, 10 years of life, children's behavior is corrected every 6 to 9 minutes. So every 6 to 9 minutes of waking life, a parent or some other adult, don't do that, don't do that. So kids are getting constant correction. And this is a very dramatic contrast to language, because in language, there is no correction. In language, when children say something grammatically incorrect, most of the time, it doesn't get corrected. If the child is understood, the parent, in fact, shows approval. They're delighted if they've understood what their young child is trying to say, so they don't care about getting the grammatical rules right. And the argument for the innateness of language has focused on that idea. It's focused on what's called the poverty of the stimulus, and the idea is that the information that children get in language learning is too limited to explain the rules they end up with. And the technical reason for this is they don't get negative feedback. If I just utter a sentence, so I produce a sentence like, the floor is black, there are many, many different rules that are consistent with that sentence. So if you're a language learner and you have to figure out which rule is the correct rule, you have no constraints. You could come up with 100 different rules that could have produced that sentence. So unless I give you negative feedback and tell you, no, that rule is wrong, that other one is wrong, that other one is wrong, you'll be left with too many choices, and you'll end up producing ungrammatical sentences frequently. So you need negative feedback to learn unless you have innate knowledge. But with morality, there is a lot of negative feedback. In fact, it's mostly negative feedback, and it happens all day, every day throughout childhood. So the argument for innateness from a poverty of the stimulus can't get off the ground. Okay, I will stop there and end here. Sorry we're going so long. I've been trying to argue that the evidence for innateness is not very strong. But if morality is not innate, where does it come from? And the obvious answer is that it comes from our history and our culture. And the figure in philosophy who's most associated with this idea is Nietzsche, depicted here. And we could break now, and then I could talk a little bit about historical approaches, if that's preferable. Yeah, and then just I'll spend a few more minutes talking about this, and then we'll have general discussion. So well, it's up to you. I can go for 5, 10 more minutes now, and then I'll be done, or we can break now. If people are...
What do you prefer?
What do you all prefer?
Go on.
Go on? Okay. So Nietzsche tells this story. He thinks that Christian values, our values that we inherit from the European Christian tradition, are really the result of history. And he tells this very crazy story about how the Christians were suppressed. They were oppressed by the Romans. The Romans were treating the Christians badly. The Christians were very poor. And when the Christians came to power, they turned the Roman values into evil. They said everything the Romans like is bad. And they turned their own kind of life, their life of poverty and misery, into a virtue. So you find Jesus giving the Sermon on the Mount saying poverty is a virtue, that we should care for the needy. All of these things Nietzsche thinks are a result of what he calls a slave revolt in morality. This is a poster from a movie called The Slave Revolt about early Christianity. It's a very bad Italian film from the 60s. Anyway, I think Nietzsche was just wrong. I think he got the history wrong. I think early Christianity was largely a Roman and middle-class movement, not a movement of the poor. But that's a long story. But I think the basic approach was correct, which is to say, I think we can look at morality in a historical way and account for the origin of morals by doing some kind of historical analysis. And we started to talk about this already in discussion yesterday, so I will be brief. But consider, to take one example, cannibalism. So it's controversial, but there is a good amount of anthropological evidence that many cultures have engaged in cannibalism. This is actually a painting by a European from the 16th century depicting cannibalism in a Brazilian group, and the Europeans greatly exaggerated cannibalism in the Americas in order to create excitement and horror about the indigenous people of the Americas. But there is evidence that cannibalism was practiced by a number of groups, including the Aztecs in Mexico, among others. And the question is why? And various anthropologists have looked at this, and one answer is that cannibalism is actually a very sensible practice. It makes sense from a cost-benefit analysis. So suppose you end up in a violent fight with your neighbor because you're competing over resources. You're living in a small society and you're trying to hunt or find food in the same part of the forest, and you end up getting into a violent conflict. If you kill somebody in that conflict, you're left with a dead body. And once you have a dead body, the question is, what do you do with a dead body? Now, if you're a very small-scale society that works very hard to gather food and to hunt, a dead body is a food source. You shouldn't waste it. You shouldn't waste anything. These are societies that don't have stored food. They have no way of preserving foods. So if they find themselves with an edible food source, human meat, they might as well eat it. So cannibalism makes sense. Suppose you take some captives. You win your battle with your enemy, but you haven't killed everyone. You now have some captives. With the captives, you have 3 choices. You could let your captives go. You've captured some people, they're your prisoners, you could let them go. But this is stupid because they'll get revenge. They will come back and kill you. You could keep them as slaves. That sounds very nice. It's good to have slaves. But slaves you have to feed. You have to police them. You have to prevent them from escaping. The slaves can kill you. So it's very dangerous to bring slaves back. And if you don't have intensive agriculture, the slaves are going to cost more than they produce for the group. Slaves won't work very hard. They can't produce that much food. So you don't want to keep your slaves. You don't want to keep your prisoners as slaves. So you can't free them, you can't enslave them. One choice left. If you have captives, you kill them. And if you kill them, you have a body. And if you have a body, you should eat it. So it's completely sensible. And what anthropologists have argued is really the puzzle. The question is why we don't engage in cannibalism today. Why did cannibalism stop if it's such a sensible practice? So Americans are off killing people in Afghanistan as we speak. Why don't they just take those bodies home and eat them? So it's very strange. And the theory that's been offered by an anthropologist named Marvin Harris goes like this. Harris says, when a society gets large enough to have a military and police, it develops the ability to enforce taxation on its neighbors. So when you get, say, take the Inca Empire had enough strength and infrastructure that they could take an army, bring it into a neighboring group, and say, we want money, we want tribute, give us food, give us resources. If you don't, we will destroy you. Now, that's a really nice situation for the Inca, because the Inca can keep getting new food from the same group over and over again. They can come each year or each month and collect some tribute money, some taxation from their neighbors. So their neighbors provide not just one big meal in a cannibal feast, but lots of meals because they keep bringing in new tax money. So once you get enough organization to force your neighbors to pay you taxes, it's much better to get the tax money than to kill them. When you kill them, it's one meal with tax money. It could be meals for a lifetime. So cannibalism disappears. Very briefly on some of these other things, blood sports. Rome was an empire. It was expanding. It was trying to establish a military culture where the greatest virtue was showing bravery in battle. So by having blood sports where people show fearlessness in the face of death, and by also bringing together individuals wearing very different forms of clothing that represent previous conquests of Rome, the Roman Empire was able to instill these values that there is one Rome. It's made of many different cultures, but it's one group, and it's a group that's come together through bravery and fearlessness in the face of death. So in their imperial context, it turned out to be valuable. Monogamy turns out to be a very rare form of marriage. In only about 12 to 15% of societies do you find monogamy being the only legal form of marriage. Most societies are polygamous. And you can see with polygamy that it might be the kind of form that would exist in a society where you have male dominance. So if women are not allowed to work, if women can't just go out and get jobs, they depend on men for money. And if you have a class society where some men become very wealthy, then a lot of women may end up wanting to marry the same man because he has money enough to share with each of them, and that's their only chance of survival is to marry, so each woman will try to marry the most successful man she can. As you get an increase in opportunity for women, you get more monogamy. But other factors have contributed to the rise of monogamy. I'll just mention one, and it's a disturbing one, slavery. Chattel slavery. So slavery where human beings were treated as animals, like the transatlantic slave trade, meant that men could have female slaves as sex partners. So rather than having a wife who you have to take care of and treat nicely, you could have a sex slave. And we don't think about this aspect of slavery very often. We think about it as a labor market, but slavery was equally a sex market. And the presence of slavery reduced the motivation to have large family structures. Somebody asked yesterday about gay marriage. There is some evidence, which I mentioned informally yesterday, that as the cost of rearing children increases, the tolerance of gay marriage also increases. So as it's become more costly to have children, more people start to think it's acceptable to have a marriage arrangement that won't necessarily result in children. So that's just a figure showing that correlation. And I'll stop in just a minute with a remark on incest. So if you look at incest, you can see huge variation in tolerance of incest. So I said in the Islamic world, incest is actually a preferred form of marriage. So this is the percentage of marriage between cousins globally. And you can see these very dark numbers, like 50%. So you can see in a lot of North Africa and the Near East, a very, very high concentration of cousin marriage. More than 50% are married to cousins. And these are tribal societies where the organization is very decentralized. Families are the major unit of power. So keeping wealth within the family is increased if you can marry your cousins. When you have societies that have a high degree of social hierarchy and centralized government, the effort to break up the family occurs. People in governments, in countries that have very strong governments, don't like when power and wealth is consolidated within a family, so they introduce rules that prevent families from keeping their money together. Those rules might be taxation rules, but they're also marriage rules. One more remark about slavery. Maybe I'll skip. Well, a quick remark about slavery. I'd be very interested to know the history of Peruvian slavery, but slavery was a dominant form of social and labor organization until the 19th century in large-scale societies. Just about every society that achieved statehood had slaves, and then it disappears very quickly. And the question is why? And at least one important part of that answer is the Industrial Revolution. So it's not an accident that slavery disappears when a radically new economic system emerges. And the Industrial Revolution introduces the idea of wage labor, the idea that you get paid for the number of hours that you work. And if you look at the history of slavery in England, for example, it really was the industrialists who argued most for the elimination of slavery. And they argued against slavery because they wanted people to come and volunteer to work in their factories in very bad conditions without any social programs or protection. And they said, well, at least you're free. And this rhetoric of at least you're free was used as a powerful tool in getting people to support the Industrial Revolution. If you look at torture, this is the last example, torture is very frequently practiced. It's practiced in large parts of the world, but its practice has a very characteristic profile. We tend to torture when we believe there is an enemy within. If you believe that there are people within your nation who are different from you but pose a threat, that's when you start to tolerate torture. So if you consider the Inquisition with the torture of Jews, this is a picture by Goya, Francisco de Goya y Cientes, of an auto de fe. So this is a heretic or a Jew being brought up for trial and execution. This kind of torture had to do with the presence of these non-Christians within the Christian community who are seen as a threat. Stalin engaged in very wide-scale and massive torture because he was very paranoid that there were people who were ideologically different from him who might be trying to take power. We see in the dirty war of Argentina a very high tolerance of torture when, again, it was thought that there were people on the left who would potentially take over the government, and that's an enemy within. The communist threat from within leads to tolerance of torture. And in the United States today, the idea that there are terrorists that have infiltrated American society who might cause a threat from within has led to incredible tolerance of torture as well. So I think you can look at this combination of psychological and historical factors to explain why attitudes towards morality occur in one place and one time that differ from the moral attitudes in another place and another time. And this, of course, was Nietzsche's view. So we'll end by making Nietzsche smile. We'll take a break now. I had a couple of slides on debunking. If the question comes up, we can talk about that. But I think we probably already have enough to talk about now. So let me stop here. Thanks, and sorry I went so long.
Ya podemos comenzar el debate entonces, así que siéntanse totalmente libres de formular sus preguntas, objeciones, sean preguntas de aclaración, sean cuestionamientos. Si desean hacerlo en inglés, está muy bien. Si prefieren hacerlo en castellano, yo lo puedo traducir.
¿Dónde está el micrófono? Acá. Well, I think that you have an operationalist approach to concepts or to reality. if you say that sentiments are crucial, are necessary, and even sufficient for morals or morality, I have a question related to the comparison between men and, for example, chimps. Chimps experiment rage. And they experiment rage, for example, when some rules of fair play are broken. So if they experiment rage, what is the difference with humans? Why not say that they have an innate moral sense?
Good. It's a very important question. I think chimps do experience rage. For me, the problem with chimps is twofold. There are two limitations. One is that the rage tends to be personal. It's a reactive aggression. There are some exceptions to this anecdotally, but most of the rage is about a response to someone who's been aggressing against me as opposed to aggressing against my group. Or even less common, you won't find a chimp aggressing or showing rage in response to an attack on a totally unrelated chimp. So if we walk down the street and we see someone being attacked brutally, we don't need to know that victim in order to feel rage. But chimps don't seem to generalize in this way. And the other thing is chimps don't seem to show guilt. So consider a young child. If a young child, if you try and take a toy or a piece of food from a young child, the child will show rage. The child will get very upset, very angry. But if the child takes food from someone else or takes a toy from someone else, they don't seem to feel guilty about it. So young children are like apes in this way, or they're kind of like psychopaths in this way. They'll get angry if something happens to them, but they don't feel bad if they do it themselves. So these responses are very selfish. They're very one-sided. So I don't want to overstate the point, though. I think you're quite right that we should always look for continuity. And this capacity for rage, I think, is really a fundamental building block, maybe the fundamental building block for morality. So I stated my point in a very strong way, but I think a more careful formulation would be simply that what apes have is a precursor to morality, but it may be missing certain elements that become very important to morality. And if you want to make the claim that morality itself is evolved or innate, that might not be true, but you could make a more modest claim and say a precursor for morality is innate. That probably would be true.
Hi. There's this experiment with very young infants where they are shown a video with someone distributing food between two persons. And in one version of this video, both persons are given the same amount. In the other version, one of them is not given anything or very, very less than the other one. And these very young infants seem to be surprised when one of the persons doesn't get anything, like if they were aware of some kind of inequality. What would be your opinion on this?
I don't know this particular experiment. Was it done by the Yale group? Like Val, do you know who did it? Yeah, I think in each of these cases one has to look very closely at the details of the experiments. So, for example, there was a very early experiment in this area done showing that young infants draw a distinction between people who help and people who cause harm. But if you look at the details of the experiment, they're very problematic. In the first study that was published, the infants actually look longer when a little puppet approaches a helper than when the puppet approaches the harmer. And when they look longer if the
puppet approaches the good guy as opposed to the bad guy. And in most developmental research, it's assumed that looking time is evidence for surprise. But in this case, they should be surprised about the opposite behavior. And then in subsequent studies, they use the same little figures, but they put eyes on them, and the looking time pattern reversed. And so a lot of these studies, a subtle manipulation makes a difference. And not to criticize developmental psychology, but there's always a risk that you have a psychologist trying the same thing in 5 different ways. It doesn't work for 4 of them, so they don't have a publishable result. It works for the 5th. Maybe for the 6th, it would have gone the opposite way. So we really need convergent data. And the strongest developmental results are ones where we've seen multiple labs show the same effect in a lot of different ways. There's been a lot of effort to look at distribution principles in kids and also in non-human animals. And a lot of the studies that have come out before have been problematic. So, for example, there was a study with monkeys showing that monkeys will stop working for unequal pay. So if 2 monkeys are getting rewards for behavior, but one gets more reward than the other stops working. And this was interpreted as a sign that monkeys have a sense of fairness. But the study proved to be problematic because there's a famous result in animal behavior that if an animal is just in visual eye contact with a higher reward, it will just stop doing whatever it's doing. It has nothing to do with fairness, they get very excited when they see a possibility of a higher reward. And if you include a control condition where you don't give another animal the reward, but simply create a big pile of fruit, the animal also stops working. So it's not necessarily a moral judgment at all. In this particular case, there may even be visual features that are surprising of seeing inequality. There may be a biologically based preference for symmetry, and that could create an increased looking time for asymmetry. Anything that's irregular could end up becoming more interesting to infants. So I would want to look at the study before I made any comment on it. But I do think that's a promising area of research to try and test for these innateness claims. And I'm very excited to learn about this study.
Hello. I have a question regarding a psychological study as well that I can't recall the details correctly, but it was basically that the power was given to a group of people in a prison, I believe, and they wouldn't be, reprimanded or they wouldn't be considered misbehaved if they started punishing the ones that were called prisoners. Mm-hmm. And they abused of the power that they owned, and they did so by beating them or proceeding to other forms of torture, so to speak. So you previously mentioned that morality is part of our long-term memory. I mean, moral values are stored in our brains. So what happens when you're given this sort of a power and you completely disregard this sort of moral values?
Good.
I mean, does the long-term ability for you to store them, is it eliminated, or is it that we can't recall it correctly?
Great, really interesting question, and an important one. The experiment you described is Philip Zimbardo's prison experiment that was done on the Stanford campus in the 1970s. And he found that if you give people a role just by chance of playing the prisoner as opposed to the guard, it affects their values and their behavior. And when the cases of torture were disclosed from Abu Ghraib, it was very interesting to see how very similar the abuses were to what he observed in the Stanford prison experiments. So there was a lot of one might say, psychosexual torture in the Stanford prison experiments. People were forced to give up their clothing. They were forced to imitate homosexual acts. They were prevented from having bathroom access. So very extreme forms of humiliation and discomfort involving the body. And you see very, very similar things happening in these prison contexts. in the real world. And I think what these cases illustrate is the fact that morality may be something that isn't considered the same for all people. People in a position of power often consider themselves free from certain moral constraints that apply to others. And you can see this pattern quite systematically. So I mentioned incest norms. There are a lot of societies where many forms of incest are illegal, but among the ruling elite, they're not illegal. So in order, for example, for kings in a dynasty to remain in power, they want to marry within the family so they can keep that power in the bloodline, even though this would be considered a very punishable offense among the people. But the pattern is even more general. So the wealthy will often take liberties, will engage in abuses that would be considered very serious offenses if they were perpetrated by people with less power. And I think this is an observation that Nietzsche made, that morality is very much about power. So if you want to understand the morality of a society, it's important to understand who is in power and how morality is being used as an instrument of control. So critics of the prison system, for example, Michel Foucault, have tried to argue that we've come to believe that the prison system is perfectly acceptable and humane, but it's really being used as an instrument of a certain kind of control that allows the people who are in power to completely deprive other individuals of autonomy, of liberty, and basic human rights. I think the link between morality and power has been neglected in analytic philosophy and also in moral psychology. So if you look at psychological research, or if you look at normative ethical theory, you see the word power arising very, very rarely. But we need to bring it back into the discussion to fully understand how morality works.
Yeah, so you mentioned yesterday this fact that people who don't like unclean toilet seats and people who have been, or like eating a soup that has an unclean spoon or something, and I think the fact that they would be scared if someone had died in their hotel room, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Then the night before, they would be scared about it. That those people who were shocked by that or felt disgust or whatever, they were against gay marriage and also abortion. So I was wondering if you can comment on that and what's the relation between that.
Great. Yeah. First, I'm very impressed that you read that slide so closely and remembered it. The claim that's made by David Pizarro, who did this research, is that abortion and gay marriage are both about regulation of the body, what you can do with your body. Even though there's a lot of effort to try and talk about abortion as a kind of murder and therefore relate it to not so much the body but to autonomy, to people's right to exist, which would be an anger-based norm instead of a disgust-based norm. When people think about abortion, they think about this very ugly surgical procedure that involves an invasion of the body, removal of a fetus, which is something we would regard with disgust if we saw it in life. So we can see how these kinds of both of these kinds of behavior, what's considered abnormal sexual behavior and a behavior that involves a surgical procedure, might both be things that we would view with a certain degree of disgust. Disgust is an emotion that's evolved to protect the body against contamination. Some of the biggest sources of disgust are bodily fluids. So every body fluid causes disgust, with one exception. Does anyone know the exception? Tears. So when you cry, we don't tend to find that disgusting. I find it a little disgusting. But Just a joke. Maybe there's something about machismo culture where men find tears disgusting. But when you have anything that involves in what's sometimes called, and the psychologist Paul Rozin, who is the world's expert on disgust, calls it violation of the body envelope, which is a very dramatic term for penetrating into the body, anything that involves breaking the surface of the body, that we regard as disgusting because it reveals the interior. It reveals blood, it reveals bones, it reveals organs, and disgust is evolved to protect us against those things that might lead to bodily contamination. So if you see bodily fluids or tissue or a decaying body, those things are all potentially dangerous because they can contaminate us. If you have a moral rule, let's go back to the question about power. Suppose you're in power and you want to spread a moral rule and you have to figure out what emotion to use for that moral rule. Well, if it's a behavior that involves bodily fluids, it's very powerful to use disgust because disgust has a predisposition to protect us against unusual encounters with bodily fluids. So both abortion and gay marriage might be instances of this. But I should comment too that it's probably not a perfectly pure case, because when you think about abortion, it's also conceptualized as a form of murder, and that tends to produce anger. When you think about gay marriage, you might think about this as a threat to family structure, to a traditional family, and that's not about the body, that's more about social organization. So you might again feel anger. So I think the emotions that people feel in response to these particular behaviors depends very much on how they are conceptualized at a specific moment. So when somebody is fighting against abortion and they carry a picture that shows a mangled fetus, they're trying to produce disgust. But when they carry a slogan that says abortion is murder, they're trying to produce anger. And whenever we're fighting for a moral cause, we want to use as much emotional manipulation as we can. So if you can conceptualize the same crime in different ways, you will. So the findings from Pizarro, I think, are best interpreted as showing that crimes that involve the body are more likely to be associated with disgust than with anger. But they might be associated to some degree with both.
I think that's
Yeah, please.
Well, I think that's interesting, the fact about bodily fluids and being of your own body, you know, like being the boss of your body or whatever. It's interesting when it comes to gay marriage because there is also an exchange of bodily fluids in heterosexual marriages.
Yeah.
But people tend not to look at marriages that way. I think when it comes to gay people, men or women, sex is all you are. If you're gay, that's your main quality. And people often, I'm gay, people often ask you, well, how do you do it? And you don't reply, well, how do you do it? Like, what's your favorite position, you know? And abortion as well, I think women who have abortions are considered also like sluts or whatever because of the sex factor, and that involves also the fluids. So I think maybe people who are easily disgusted are because they consider only one aspect of the abortion or one aspect of being gay.
Good. Yeah, that helps because I should make an important clarification, which is that it's not that people are innately disposed to find homosexual intercourse disgusting or abortion disgusting. It's rather that whenever bodily fluids are involved, that is something that can be used to introduce disgust by drawing attention to that. So we don't have any, even a young child may eat excrement, may eat feces. There are cultures where people drink urine. So it's not that these things automatically cause disgust. It's rather that disgust is really evolved to protect us from very specific kinds of things like rotting meat or dead bodies. But because it has that evolutionary role, if you draw similarities, if you bring out the connection between those things that are evolved to cause disgust and something that's completely healthy, something that isn't a source of contamination, you can get people to learn the connection through association. If you read St. Augustine on sex, Augustine really very strongly criticizes sexuality, heterosexual sexuality. And he thinks sexuality is wrong, it's immoral, sex is always immoral, but it's a permissible evil if it's done for procreation. Sex for any other reason is bad. And when he does this, if you read the text, he again and again uses disgust. So he draws attention to these weird animalistic connections between human bodies in heterosexual sex, and he says this is filthy, it's disgusting, it's an animalistic behavior, it's driven by an urge, we can't control it. Augustine faced the following question, a very technical question for theologians: was sex immoral in Eden before the fall? And his answer, of course, the standard answer is no. But he's a philosopher, so he needs an explanation. Why is sex immoral now, but it wasn't immoral before the fall? And what Augustine says is that before the fall, Adam, the first man, Adam, could control his erections by act of will. This is true. This is what he says. And why would he say this? The answer is that it's the lack of control that makes sex very animalistic. Sex is something we cannot control, and that makes us like beasts. And by drawing that analogy, he puts sex in a new light. So instead of seeing it as romantic, as beautiful, as intimate, as even sacred, you start to see it as, oh, I'm behaving like a beast. I don't have control over myself. I've become an animal. And at that point, we're able to see sex as disgusting. So the moral educator has to reconstrue these very healthy, safe activities in a new way in order to get the emotions off the ground. Yeah, please.
I'd like to ask you exactly what kind of nativism is the one you are rejecting. Because it seems to me clear that you are rejecting some specific kind of nativism, which is the model of principles and parameters claimed by people like Hauser on Rawls' analogy. But would you also reject that there are innate tendencies that are the roots of morality? For instance, cooperation, compassion, symmetry, and on the other hand, many people claim that there are universally morally good emotions and universally morally bad emotions. For instance, bad emotions are things like envy, anger, etc., whereas good emotions would be happiness, generosity, love, compassion, and they are good because they help putting together society. So if you accept this distinction, that there are universally morally good emotions and universally morally bad emotions, maybe we could ground the idea that there is some kind of universal morality grounded in these universally morally loaded emotions.
Yes, I think there is a blank slate view, a view that says we begin with nothing and end up with morality, that has to be rejected. It's obviously false. So the question is whether the things that contribute to morality are specific to that domain or more general. So the kind of innateness claim I reject is one that says that there are features of human biology, features of our psychology that have a biological basis, that are evolved because they eventuate in moral rules. Let me give an analogy. which is to marriage, because this came up. Is marriage innate? Well, at some level, every culture has marriage. Every culture has some system for bringing people together in some kind of kinship bond that has been associated with things like child rearing and sharing of property. But marriage varies tremendously from culture to culture. So much so that the anthropologist Clifford Geertz, who I mentioned yesterday, calls marriage a pseudo-universal. It's not a real universal. And if you look, for example, at who can marry whom, we've seen already a difference between polygyny, polyandry, and monogamy. What age people can marry? Can people marry children? That varies from culture to culture. Is marriage by choice or by arrangement? That varies from culture to culture. Does marriage involve a ceremony or merely living together? That varies from culture to culture. Do married couples live together? That varies from culture to culture. Is extramarital sex permitted? That varies from culture to culture. Is marriage required for sex? That varies from culture to culture. And so on down the line. Is divorce permissible? That varies from culture to culture. So the rules for bringing people together, can they be of the same sex? All of this varies. But of course, biology contributes something to marriage. And one way to think about that contribution is that the mere fact of human procreation means that if there is a biological urge to procreate, and there is a product of procreation, babies are born, then people who are involved in creating new life are forced into a kind of social bond, at least for the purposes of conceiving a child, and that's a behavior that a society will have a strong interest in regulating. So societies take this very natural behavior, which is sexuality, and they realize that this is a behavior that involves social relationships. And whenever you have social relationships, societies become interested in regulation. It's also behavior for which there could be tremendous conflict, because if multiple parties are trying to have sexual access to the same individual, that can lead to violence. Violent competition. So societies introduce rules for who has access. So the very fact about the human nature of procreation, the very fact that we're prone to violent competition in order to achieve sexual access, introduces a demand for which marriage is a solution. And I think there's a lot about human behavior that leads to violent competition, it leads to resource competition, that requires some construction of rules. And the rules that we construct are not arbitrary. They may depend on our prior predispositions about distribution, but importantly, as you bring out, they may depend very strongly on our emotional repertoire. And I don't think we should call emotions like anger and guilt bad. I think from a moral perspective, they're good, they're essential, in that they are extremely important for achieving social cohesion in certain contexts. If you don't feel guilty about bad behavior, for example, if you're a psychopath, you might have very little motivation to obey the rules of your society. So the innateness that appears in the moral case may be something like an innate tendency to have reactive aggression, an innate tendency to have attachment relationships, and feel sad when your loved ones stop treating you nicely, and an innate tendency to try to distribute resources in a way that reduces violent response. That's a lot. I mean, that's already a lot of what is involved in very advanced moral systems, like you would find in a society that has explicit laws. So I think when we get into a verbal question of whether we should call that innate morality or not innate morality, it's possible to see it from both perspectives. one reason why I like to resist the term innateness here is I think that these very capacities also exist outside of the moral domain. And it's important to see that because if we don't recognize their role outside of the moral domain, we'll lose sight of the way in which morality incrementally appears from capacities that might originate in some non-moral way. So in a way, it's a bit ironic, but it's precisely because of an interest in telling a kind of evolutionary story or developmental story that I think describing morality as having non-moral origins is so important. One way to think about innateness is you want to explain how you ended up with a capacity, and innateness is a non-explanation. It says it's already there. Immer schon da. It's kind of saying that we don't need to explain its origin because we have it to begin with. And I think just in terms of constructing a theory or an explanation, it's helpful to assume that we don't have it and then figure out how we get it from simpler things. And I think in the moral case, that style of explanation turns out to be very illuminating.
Yes, I agree that even what we call bad emotions can have a survival value, of course. They do have survival value. But I would like to ask you whether you think that all societies tend to judge morally emotions. For instance, societies tend to judge that love is good, generosity is good, compassion is good. We have to raise our children that way, whereas envy is bad, hate is bad, selfishness is bad, and there is a reason for that. You cannot have a society where everybody is selfish. You cannot have a society where hate is a basic and primordial emotion. So there is a reason of survival there. Now, the question is, if you accept, I'm not sure you would accept, I think you won't accept, but if you accept that there's some kind of universal judgment of emotions which is connected to reasons of survival, then we might just accept at least some kind of universality. A universality based on different kind of morally loaded emotions.
It's a great question. I think it would be a very good question to investigate. My guess is that you won't find that universality. You won't find the same attitudes towards these emotions across cultures. Speaking a bit personally, I'm against compassion, at least against empathy, and I'm strongly in favor of hate. This makes me a kind of anti-Buddhist. And the reason is empirical. I think that empathy and compassion are strongly prone to bias. That is, we tend to be much more empathetic to people who are similar to us, much more compassionate for people who are similar to us. So if you build morality based on empathy, you'll tend to have a very biased morality. But there's also research suggesting that empathy is not a very strong motivator. So you can feel very empathetic when you read a story about people suffering from poverty, but it doesn't make you go out and help. Anger is a very strong motivator. Hate is a very strong motivator. And there are conditions when hate is appropriate. So your enemies attack you, and you could feel empathetic. You could love your enemies, as the Christian gospel says, or you could hate your enemies. And this is, of course, controversial, but I think it's more effective to hate your enemies. And at least there's a context where that kind of hatred becomes useful. If you think about things like the women's movement, where you generate a kind of indignation, you say, women say to each other, look at your lives, you're living as domestic slaves. You're prisoners, you're not allowed to seek employment, you're not given sexual autonomy, you're basically living in a condition of subservience to a man. And when you point that out, one response is to become very empathetic and say, let's feel sorry for ourselves, and all women should get together and have a collective moping session where they're all so sad about their condition. That wouldn't be very effective. But another response is rage, and it's rage that seems to be liberating. So there's there's even a kind of joy in rage. When a group gets together and finds the solidarity to fight oppression, it's very uplifting. But it's a kind of anger that's uplifting. There are even societies that have an emotional term for this special feeling of empowering hatred. So I think it's very difficult to look at these things as an emotion category and form a judgment. Is it good or bad? A lot depends on the context. In a small-scale society, anger is a disaster because anger creates a break in the group. If you get angry at somebody who's mistreated you and you start fighting and can't talk to each other anymore, your group might fall apart. So there are societies where anger is considered an absolute taboo. But in a large-scale society, anger might be an instrument of liberation. Love, there's some evidence that in some societies where people have arranged marriages, love is considered a very dangerous emotion because love is something that's going to threaten the arranged marriage system. If you fall in love with someone and want to marry that person, it's not the person your family has chosen for you. Love might cause you to have an extramarital affair. It might cause you to create a pregnancy before an arranged marriage occurs. So love is seen as something very negative, something that we need to resist and control. There may be friendship forms of love that emerge after a marriage has been arranged, but at least certain forms of love which we may value in our cultures might be considered a very negative emotion in others. Even happiness itself has been looked at in studies in positive psychology, and in some places, for example, in the West, happiness is considered a very positive emotion, but in parts of East Asia, it's not considered so positive. In North America, you say your life is going well as a function of how happy you are. But in China, achieving happiness, having lots of positive feelings is not very important for well-being. It's not a strong correlation for well-being. Working together for the good of the group is much more important than achieving personal gratification and joy. So we do find interesting cultural differences.
While I was listening to your discussion about some feelings that are positive or negative, maybe even love, compassion, hate, it's a bit more complex. Maybe there's a simpler level, which is just pleasure or not pleasure. So the difference, maybe to love somebody in these cultures that will put you in a position where you are in danger, when somebody can hurt you, they can torture you, which will be unpleasant for you, and in other cultures it's pleasant because you can, So maybe the universal thing is not like these emotions, but maybe something a bit simpler. I like this, I don't like this gives me pleasure, this doesn't give me pleasure. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, I think there's a distinction that we should draw between two ways in which an emotion might be considered positive. One is that it feels good, that it's something that we would like to have a lot of, and the other is that it's good for us. And I think these very often go together, but they're not perfectly correlated. So if you consider something like fear, which is very unpleasant, doesn't feel good, turns out to be very good for us because it protects us from danger. So I think a case could be made that many emotions have a kind of intrinsic quality that can make them pleasant or unpleasant, but that doesn't mean that we should eliminate the ones that are unpleasant. The ones that are unpleasant may be highly adaptive. Yeah. Yes.
Yes, but certain emotions will make you act in a certain way, right? So fear, yeah, it's unpleasant. But if I see a lion coming in and I have fear and I act on that fear, I go out the other way.
Yeah.
And I'm saved, that will give me pleasure.
Yeah, so it may be that there's a...
So that's or like you were saying, like feeling angry usually you don't like to feel angry, you feel uncomfortable. But if you use that anger to, like you were saying, something proactive, you can turn around that feeling and you make it be pleasurable, because you're maybe the action that goes after that feeling of like or dislike is what is pleasurable or unpleasurable and can make the difference. I don't know if
I think it's a good and subtle point. In fact, there's an old neuroimaging study that suggests that you see reward activity, areas of the brain associated with reward. The nucleus accumbens active when people are experiencing fear, and it was interpreted as the reward of seeking shelter, of imagining escape. So in a way, it's hard to assign any fixed valence, positive or negative, to emotions. We always need to think about the role of negative emotions as bringing us to a more positive state. But two quick remarks. One, there's also evidence that extreme positive emotions are bad for us, and that the nervous system tries to achieve equilibrium. So we all know about drug withdrawal, and one of the biological explanations for drug withdrawal is, it's a Freudian slip, is that the nervous system doesn't like extreme happiness. It's very destabilizing. So it tries to create this counter effect, what's called an opponent process, that brings you back down after you've been very happy. And that can suggest that really what's positive for us is to have no emotions at all. That is a very Buddhist or Stoic point, which is a strange point. But I think all of this, when we're talking about whether emotions are valuable, immediately brings us into a very relativist domain, because you might have a Stoic morality that says, let's embrace homeostasis, let's embrace the biological ideal of having no emotions at all. And then you might have a utilitarian or a hedonist critique of that says, no, but pleasure is extremely pleasurable. It's trivially true that pleasure is a good thing, so let's have as much pleasure as possible. And then you might have a kind of existentialist who says, no, really the deep existential questions in life are the most important. And if you don't experience dread, if you don't experience the anxiety about death, you won't understand your mortality. And if you don't understand your mortality, you don't understand your responsibility for choice in constructing meaning in your life. So dread becomes this very valuable emotion for the existentialist. Or you might be a poet, and you might say, as a poet, I want to have extremes of emotion of every kind. Let me write one poem about euphoria and another poem about despair. And that is a very different, it's an aesthetic view that says variation is what contributes to a good emotional life. But all of these are evaluative differences, they're moral differences, and I think it would be very hard to find a universal view about which emotions are good and which emotions are bad, given that kind of variation.
Another question. I think your main claim is grounded in the distinction between moral behavior and moral judgment. So it seems to me that you can accept that there is some kind of moral behavior that has biological roots, but you would not accept there is moral judgment based on biological roots. So far, so good?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, my question is, would you accept that the morality, even judgment, would be a byproduct, a spandrel, of other different adaptive functions, like, for instance, meta-representation, simulation, social intelligence, language, etc. The ontogenetic development of children suggests that they can make moral judgments only from 5 years old, not before. And children of every different kinds of societies, every different kind of cultures. So you don't find children of three-year-old children that are able of making moral judgments. You can only find them at around 5 years old. Wouldn't that suggest that there is some kind of innate skills or abilities that are necessary and sufficient for the ability of making moral judgments, and those abilities are biological?
Great. Yeah, I definitely want to concede that there are some biological traits that are necessary. It's a little bit difficult to see what they are because we can find, for example, that people who have fairly profound deficits with metacognition can still understand moral rules and distinguish them from conventional rules. And then a question arises, is metacognition necessary for morality? And one answer is, it's not necessary at the individual level, but it's necessary at the group level. That is, if you didn't have some people with metacognition in the group, they would never have developed these moral rules to then transmit to people who don't have metacognition. So I think these questions about what is necessary and for whom are extremely important and interesting areas for research. But some of these psychological capacities are clearly necessary. I think in a way the more interesting question is about sufficiency. So if you merely have a standardly developing human mind, is it inevitable that you end up with morality? And there are different ways to approach this question. One way is to think about, say, an individual raised without society. So we have some very exotic examples of this, like the wild boy of Aveyron, who was a child found in France in the year 1800, who seemed to be raised by himself in the forest. And actually the person who took care of him, a physician named Itard, tried very hard to see whether the wild boy had a moral sense. So this is a very hard thing to study by science because we only have a few very isolated examples. But I think that even if you accept that society is required for morality, you might still have a fairly strong nativist view that says, like every innate trait, like language, you still need some social setting, but if you're in a wide range of very different social settings, you'll still end up with morality. So now our question becomes, is morality an inevitable outcome across a very wide range of social settings? Here, I think we don't know the answer. And the reason why I think we don't know the answer is in part because we don't really know enough about whether morality exists in very small human groups. So if you think about a small group, you ask yourself, why are you nice to your friends? One answer is because morality requires this of me. But another answer is, I'm nice to my friends because they're my friends, because I like them. I don't feel a moral obligation. It's just that these are people I care about. If you imagine a very small group where everyone knows each other, they've grown up together, they like each other, many of them are related to each other, it's possible that such a group would be motivated to treat each other well, even without ever having to think about morality, to treat each other well just because they're friends. So one possible story says that in early human societies, people who have the same psychology as us ended up achieving social cohesion without need to construct moral rules, and that morality appears only when societies start to get larger, that with the advance of certain new forms of subsistence that allow for larger society size, we suddenly need to create rules to control the behavior of strangers and to make people kind to people who aren't their friends. If that story is true, then I think the claim that our psychology is sufficient for morality can be challenged. But speaking for myself, I just don't know whether very small-scale societies always end up with morality or not. If they do, I'm prepared to say that morality is not, even if morality is not innate, it's a kind of spandrel or acceptation that will occur inevitably given human nature, or will occur most of the time.
Yes. Well, I think the question is whether we can really find a society without morality. You talk about very small groups of people, but I wonder whether that counts as a society. No? I might be wrong, but it seems to me that it would be impossible to find a society without some kind of morality, because that would be necessary for its survival. And here we can use the analogy with language too. It's impossible to find, as far as I know, a society without a language, whatever language it can be. So perhaps what you are claiming is that we might find small groups of people that don't have morality in the sense that they don't have a theoretical conception of morality. But of course, they have behavior that would be understood as morality from another point of view. What I mean is, it's obvious that we can find many societies and cultures that don't have a conception of grammar, but they do have a grammar. And my question would be, I wonder whether the same analogy would be relevant for morals.
Yeah, good. I mean, if you move outside of human beings, there are other animal species that live in large groups without morality. Yeah, I mean, insects most obviously can live in groups of hundreds, but just thinking about mammals, herd animals like wildebeests, bovine species can live in very large groups. Among primates, you can see baboons and mandrills living in groups with 100, sometimes 200 or 300 members. So extremely large groups. And it's questionable whether these animals are using moral rules, have a moral conception of the world. Cows, you might think, well, they don't need morality because they don't engage in cooperative social behavior. But every group species needs to cooperate in some sense. So if one cow is eating over here, why doesn't another cow come and just push it away? Cows have these very big horns. Why don't cows just, kill each other constantly in battles for food? And the answer is that the way they've evolved has come up with a new solution, or it's actually a very old solution for food sharing, which just involves the elimination of these aggressive tendencies. Once a species starts to get aggressive forms of competition, then you might have an increased pressure and increased need for moral rules. So when you get to animals that kill each other very frequently, the evolutionary pressure for creating something more like morality might increase. And I think we given the examples of species that are social without being moral, we simply don't know yet at what point morality is needed to create this kind of successful social living. I think it's very possible that something like morality emerges earlier than humanity, but given the possibility of social living without it, I think we can't be sure. And with language, I think this is a case where a lot of the debate turns out to be terminological. So the question is, what counts as a language? And there's clearly signaling systems in non-human animals, but they may be very different from ours. So they may be very context-specific, they may be very restricted in their meaning, they may be highly ambiguous. They're very natural as opposed to conventional. Other animals don't come up with arbitrary signs. They're very limited in their structural combinatorics, so you can't bring different symbols together to create complex meanings in most other creatures, though you do see examples of this, say, among dolphins or bees. But another important difference is just the use of signaling. It was commented some years ago by one of the very pioneering researchers in chimpanzee language research that chimps never just comment on their surroundings. So human beings are constantly just using symbols to talk about their world, as we're doing now. But with apes, it's always instrumental. I want this. And that suggests that the psychological basis of this kind of symbolic communication might be very, very different in human beings than in other creatures. And I think the same is true of morality. We might see certain patterns of behavior that are similar important respects to social rules that we call moral rules, but they may differ in other respects. And we could call all of this morality using that term very broadly, or we can define the term morality more narrowly and say just human beings have morality. So when people like Chomsky say just human beings have language, it's because they've stipulated a definition of language that's quite narrow. And I'm doing something similar. I'm stipulating a characterization of the psychology of morality that's quite specific, quite narrow. The rules need to be emotionally based. They need to be grounded in specific emotions. They need to be abstract and apply to unrelated third parties. But you could define morality in a broader way, and your answer would turn out to be different. In that sense, there's no real substantive debate between the nativist and the anti-nativist, because the term morality is something we can define in different ways. But what is substantive, what does matter, is the specifics, the questions about whether what we do when we share food is the same as what a chimpanzee does when it shares food. And I think there, the possibility that there's a lot of important difference remains scientifically plausible. We shouldn't assume that the superficial similarities in behavior are based on underlying psychological similarities.
The main theme of your conference is morality, but you have also spoken about language, and I would like to make a question about language. You mentioned the question of the innateness of language, and you said that you were against that thesis and that there was a strong turn in the last decade in that direction. Can you develop a little further your position in that issue?
Great. Yes. Obviously, I won't convince anyone here who is a nativist about language. In the late 1950s, but especially in the 1960s, Chomsky developed a number of arguments for the innateness of language, and they're very different in form. But each of these arguments presents some evidence for innateness, and each of them has been studied quite systematically. And I think each of them can be challenged, but in different ways. So there's no general answer, but let me give you a couple of kinds of illustrations. One kind of argument that I mentioned during the presentation is an argument from the poverty of the stimulus. And the most elaborated versions of that are actually formal. They use mathematical linguistics to express them. And the most famous of those is one that was developed by a linguist named Gold. And Gold's proof for innateness is based on the idea that there is no negative data. There's no correction in child development when incorrect sentences are produced. But the argument, the formal argument, is based on a specific model, a specific mathematical model of how language is learned. And what critics have tried to argue in the case of Gold's proof is that there are sources of negative data that are not included in his model. And when you include them in the model, then you start to see that there's actually a lot of negative data. And the major source of negative data comes from prediction error. Prediction error. So there's a lot of research right now, in fact it's become one of the biggest trends in cognitive science, to look at the idea that the human brain is a prediction machine, that the human brain constantly is anticipating what's going to happen next. So think about the language learner not as a speaker, not as a producer of language, but as a listener. And as a listener, what the child might be doing is anticipating what sentence or what kind of, what word or what kind of word will appear next in a linguistic string produced by someone else. If the prediction is wrong, that's an opportunity to correct the grammar that they've internalized at that time point. So there are models that build in this kind of negative data through prediction error that actually can show that the proof that we have inherited from Gold doesn't succeed. That's very far away from showing that we have the right kind of negative data to fully explain language acquisition, but it simply shows that one specific negative argument was missing an important source of information, and the argument technically fails once that source of information is present. I'll just give one more kind of example. There have been specific claims about kinds of constructions that would be very difficult for children to learn in the absence of innate resources. Some of these have to do with constraints on long-distance binding between words in a sentence. So a word in one position can modify a word far away in the sentence, and there are certain constraints within which this works. For instance, there are the constraints on subjacency. We don't need to go into the formal details, but the basic pattern of findings that have impressed me is that some of these examples that were presented very powerfully by Chomsky and some people in the generative grammar tradition have now been explained or at least simulated using computational models, where you can show that a language that doesn't obey these principles is actually unlearnable by a model that has that doesn't build in these as innate constraints. So if you have a statistical learning model, there are constraints on what would be a learnable statistical input. One very simple example of this is there are certain kinds of embedded clauses where if you were to model these with a tree structure, you would branch out in one direction, but you could imagine a language where the branching could go in two different directions. It turns out that languages with these multiple directional embeddings don't exist, but it also turns out that they're not learnable by simple learning algorithms that are used in statistical learning systems that have no domain-specific language restrictions. They wouldn't be learnable by a pattern-recognizing machine that had nothing to do with language. So some of the classic examples of things that are supposed to be signs for an innate language capacity are actually things that you would get for free if you used a generic statistical learning system to acquire linguistic competence. But just as a final point, I really want to emphasize that I agree with the nativist that the opposition still has a lot of work to do. There is no existing non-nativist account of how language is acquired. What we have at best is some suggestive evidence that arguments for innateness might not be as powerful as we once thought.
Do we have any? Perdón, tenemos otras preguntas por ahí. Susana.
If I'm not wrong, you said yesterday that parents usually punish their children just, retrieving the affect or just manipulating prices and punishment and something like that. And you said that that example adds an argument for the emotional basis of values or morals. But I think that parents do that because their children have very underdeveloped cognitive capacities. As soon they can think more complex, in more complex ways, the parents just make a turn and they begin talking to the child, trying to make them understand some principles, trying to decenter the child, trying to make them to see the point of view of the other person, and so on and so forth. So my question is this. Could you derive some pedagogical or rule or some tip for education from your point of view? I really don't see any. If a teacher or if a parent asks you, okay, following your views, following your your theoretical background or whatever, what can I do to educate a person who can think, to do a citizenship education for democracy, or whatever?
Good.
What would you say?
Well, I couldn't possibly give a good answer, but so let me draw a distinction between the developmental question and a larger question about the role of reason and morality. I do agree that developmentally, once you pass early childhood, and maybe even middle childhood, you start to get to a point where moral instruction is very discursive. It involves a lot of reasoning and explanation. And I think one of the important goals of those skills is a kind of self-knowledge where people start to understand what their moral values are, and they develop ways of extrapolating those values to new cases. And I think in some of these cases, the reasoning can be described as post hoc, that is, they're coming up with justifications for values that they've learned through emotional conditioning, and the justification is not what led to the value in the first place, but it gives a possible justification for those values. And different justifications lead to different extrapolations. So if you have, for example, and this is a point from Kohlberg, if you have a virtue theory justification for your moral rules, then when you extrapolate to new cases, what you want to do is find out whether people are acting from good character, if people are acting from virtuous character traits. If you have a utilitarian justification, you want to make sure that people's behavior increases well-being, increases happiness. If you have a Kantian justification, you want to make sure that you've respected the dignity of individual persons, you've respected autonomy and humanity. Each of these justifications might be used to justify the exact same set of rules that we learn in early childhood, but each of them has new consequences for how to extrapolate morality to new cases. So I think one of the important things that happens in mature moral learning is we end up with a variety of different options for how to go from kindergarten morality to adult morality. For instance, how to encode kindergarten morality in systems of law and social organization. But I think because these systems of justification are post hoc, because they're not part of our initial morality, it's impossible to decide which of them is the correct one. None of them have any special claim to truth. Each one is explaining or organizing the same set of kindergarten moral rules. So when we decide between them, the decision isn't a question of getting morality right. There's no fact of the matter whether Kant was right or whether Mill was right. Instead, we shift into a certain kind of instrumental reasoning. We start to think about which extrapolation, which set of laws based on kindergarten morality would be most useful for society. And that brings me to the second issue, which is once you move beyond the question of child development and think about a social level or society level role for reasoning, I think it's extremely important that we engage in moral reflection, really in moral philosophy and moral reasoning when we're constructing systems of law and social organization. And what we're doing in those cases is very instrumental. We're trying to figure out which patterns of behavior are the ones that are going to best serve our goals as a society. And what our goals are may vary from society to society, from group to group, from person to person. But when we can find goals that we can agree on, there may be a fact of the matter which system of moral rules is most conducive to those roles. So I think the role of reason here is not disclosure, it's not discovery of what the foundations of morality are, it's rather a decision, an instrumental decision about how to take morality to a new level, how to enshrine morality in law. And to that extent, the role of reasoning is really about moral refinement or moral change. It's not about the foundation. It's about the extrapolation.
Hello. I have a question about psychotherapy, because in the cognitive psychotherapy, it's usually said that you feel in response to your beliefs and your reasoning, your judgment. But in your view, it seems that the moral judgments is based on sufficiently and necessarily on emotions. So I want to know if you could make this, talk about this, and if your view is compatible with this psychotherapy way of working.
Good. Yeah, I'm very convinced that cognitive behavioral therapy is the most effective intervention we know for certain kinds of clinical syndromes. So I don't mean to be arguing against cognitive behavioral therapy. One way to think about it is that even if emotions can operate independently of cognition, emotions don't occur arbitrarily. An emotion is a response to a certain kind of event. And we can use cognition to convince ourselves that a certain kind of event is taking place. Suppose that we have a biological response to be disgusted in the presence of dirt, of filth, of grime, pollution. And now what happens is when you're presented just in a visual way with pollution, with some kind of dirt, you have this disgust response. But what happens for some people is they start to imagine dirt that isn't there, and this is a result of cognition. So they're not actually seeing the dirt, but they form a belief that it's there. So in the course of emotional learning, we move from a purely perceptual set of emotional causes to a cognitively mediated set of emotional causes, and now the mere belief that there is dirt can cause disgust. A germ you can't see can cause disgust. But because emotions can start to become cognitively mediated, they also can be cognitively corrected. So if I show you suppose I look at this floor and you see the white on the floor, and the biological system in you treats that as if it's some kind of pollution or mold or dirt, and now you say, oh, I don't want to step on this floor, so your foot is rising. Because of that dirt, you're having a perceptual response, but I could correct that perceptual response and say, no, actually this was made by the designer of the floor. It's just a pattern to simulate stone. And now you no longer believe it's dirt, and the disgust may go away. So I think emotions have an initial set of causes that are purely sensory, but we come to conceptualize those causes cognitively, and emotions can then be subsequently affected by cognition. If you take somebody who has obsessive compulsive disorder, it might be a disorder of thought. They're having irrational thoughts about the presence of pollution or the presence of dangers that aren't there. The best correction is to intervene with their thoughts, and only by changing their thoughts can you change their pattern of emotion. And I think it's a very good model for thinking about morality as well, because most of the things that we judge to be wrong in a complex society like this are things that we don't directly see. We read about them in a newspaper, we hear about them from description, but we're not actually witnessing them. So we end up with a morality that's very, very cognitively mediated. And that means that correcting somebody's moral values, changing their moral attitudes, involves a cognitive intervention. So I think it's very important in accepting an emotional view about morality that we don't see emotion as the opposite of cognition. We see emotion as working together with cognition. If you didn't have the disgust response as a bodily physical response, you wouldn't have the disorder. So the disorder is in part emotional and in part cognitive. With morality, if you didn't have the disgust response, you wouldn't have the moral rule, but you also need some sort of cognitive construal of human behavior in order to have a rule. Morality involves both cognition and emotion. Psychopathology involves both cognition and emotion, and intervention can work on either level.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias a Jesse Prinz por su excelente participación, por las dos conferencias, la de ayer y la de hoy. Muchas gracias a ustedes en nombre del Grupo Interdisciplinario de Investigación Mente y Lenguaje y de Estudios Generales Letras. Les agradecemos y será hasta una nueva ocasión. Así que nos vemos y que les vaya muy bien.